So a huge welcome to the Cabot Institute Oceans event today. Today we're going to have a panel discussion and then a question and answer session on the Arctic. And in particular, we're going to be thinking about some of the really important research questions surrounding the Arctic, some of which that we think are real research priorities going into the future. So I'll hand over briefly to everyone involved to introduce themselves first before we get going. So I'm Dr. Kate Hendy. I'm from the School of Earth Sciences here in Bristol University, and I'm an oceanographer. I specialise in chemical oceanography, and I like working in the high latitudes. So I've worked a lot in the Antarctic, but also in the Arctic as well. So I'll pass over to Martyn.
Hello, my name is Martyn Tranter. I work in the Bristol Glaciology Centre, and I'm a glacial biogeochemist. I work largely in Greenland nowadays, but I have worked in the Antarctic, and I'm interested in chemical transformations in glacial environments that are brought about by microbial processes. And I'll hand over to Jack.
Hi, I'm Jack Landy. I was also recently with the School of Geographical Sciences at the University of Bristol in the glaciology group, but recently transferred to the University of Tromso in Norway. And I've done a lot of work in the Arctic. My specialty is using satellite remote sensing to study the properties of the polar oceans and sea ice covers. And I'll hand to Sofia.
Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Sofia Galani. I'm a senior lecturer in public international law and I'm based at the law school. My research expertise lies in the fields of international law of the sea, maritime security and human rights law. I now will hand over to Chris.
Thanks. Hi everyone, I'm Chris Williamson. I'm a lecturer in polar microbiology, also at the Bristol Glaciology Centre. And this evening I will be handling the Q&A session after the talks.
Brilliant, thanks everyone. So the way this is going to work is I'll talk for about 10 minutes and the panelists will then share some of their thoughts for about 20 minutes. And then after that we should have just shy of half an hour or so to have some questions and answers. So thank you to those of you who've already posted your questions. If anything springs to mind during the presentations, then you can pop your questions into the Q&A box and we will then be able to field them thanks to Chris. I've also just noticed that my cat has walked in the room, so if you hear some howls partway through, I do apologise in advance. So with that, I will get going. Okay, so as I said already, that tonight we're going to be talking about Arctic futures. So I thought I'd just start off by asking a pretty simple question, really, which is what is the Arctic Ocean? So this might sound like a very daft question to ask, but it's worth just thinking about what the Arctic is. I'm an oceanographer, so I work in the Arctic Ocean predominantly, so apologies for being a bit ocean-centric here. But obviously the Arctic is the top of the world. So if we look down at the top of the world here, you can see the Arctic countries surrounding the vast Arctic Ocean. And we can also sort of think about the region we call the subarctic. That's another word that you might hear pop up this evening. And the Arctic Ocean can be sort of seen of in this sort of quite schematic way as a sort of interconnecting pattern of currents. So these are the major currents that influence the Arctic Ocean and the Arctic countries surrounding the oceans. And you can see that this is got sort of two main features to it. There's a great big gyre in the middle of the Central Arctic Ocean called the Beaufort Gyre, and that's really key because it controls the weather patterns in the Arctic and potentially further afield, and it also influences the other big ocean feature, which is the transpolar drift. And the transpolar drift is really important in controlling how the Arctic Ocean talks with the rest of the ocean and talks with the rest of the world. It's how the Arctic Ocean water can actually leak out of the Arctic into the rest of the world. So that's a really important feature there. So the reason that we're so interested in the Arctic in the first place is that it's a really climatically sensitive place. So it's one of the places on the planet that's warming the fastest. And not only is it climatically sensitive, it also has really important impacts itself on the climate, what we term feedbacks. And the sensitivity in these feedbacks really arise from a number of different features that are really special to the Arctic. So one of the features is ice. So there's a ton of ice in the Arctic, not surprisingly. There's ice on land, as you can see here. There's permafrost, there are glaciers, there's the Greenland ice sheet. And this is something that we'll talk quite a bit more about. It's a huge supply of fresh water to the ocean. And it's also incredibly important for for global climate because it's incredibly reflective. So a lot of the energy that arrives to the planet from the sun will get reflected back into space because the ice is so reflective. So if we lose ice, we're not only influencing the makeup of the oceans, but we're also changing the fundamental balance of radiation on the planet as well. There's not only land ice, there's sea ice as well. Sea ice is incredibly dynamic in the Arctic. And again, it's really important for that balance of radiation reflection on, for global climate as well. But it's also really key for the interaction between the ocean and the atmosphere, for example. It's really important for biology, for life. And moving on to that, the Arctic is a very productive place. There's a lot of primary production. So for example, these little algae here that you can see support a huge and diverse ecosystem within the Arctic itself. So of course, we all know about the charismatic megafauna like polar bears and the walruses, the whales, but they are all dependent on all the other components of the food chain, which are dependent on the algae, which are dependent on the fundamental makeup of the seawater itself. So I mentioned whales already. Here are two pilot whales from off the coast of Greenland. And of course, the other thing about the Arctic that you don't have in the Antarctic is that there are people involved. So 4 million people live within the Arctic Circle. A lot of them are indigenous populations that are reliant on natural resources. And so here's a huge part of the picture that we also need to consider as well. And it's not just the ice that provides this extreme environment as well. There are other extremes in the Arctic that add to this sensitivity to climate. And one of them is light availability. So for half of the year, or up to half of the year, the Arctic can be incredibly dark. There can be really not very much light. And that light is really key for all those algae, for anything that's needing light to produce food. So it means that the Arctic can be highly productive, but that productivity will be really, really seasonal. And so the interactions between things like sea ice and ice melt and the time of year that this happens is going to have really important knock-on effects for any life in the ocean or indeed on land. And so this is just sort of illustrating this idea of the polar night, the fact that you can have up to 6 months of nearly complete darkness in some parts of the central Arctic region. So the next question is why are we concerned? Why are we thinking about the Arctic as a research area of priority? There are a number of things that are changing the Arctic very quickly. As I said, it's one of the most rapidly warming parts of the planet. And as part of this warming, there are a whole load of knock-on effects. So we know that the sea ice is thinning and disappearing. We know that river runoff is changing and permafrost is melting. And all of these things have really fundamental impacts on Arctic life. So just to illustrate this a little bit, here's a video I like showing of the change of sea ice in the Arctic over the last few years. So this starts in the late 80s. And what you can see here is the sea ice, the seasonal changes in the sea ice. You can see it's highly dynamic. The brighter the color is showing the multi-year ice. So that's ice that's lasted for more than 1 year. And you can see it sort of changes throughout the year. You can see the seasons. We're now in the late 90s and things sort of carrying on. And then you sort of see a sort of fairly sudden change. This is all within all of our lifetimes, really, where you suddenly get a huge reduction, not only in the area of sea ice, but in that amount of that multi-year ice. And this is actually a very important thing. it means that the properties of the ice are changing. So this will impact on the exchange between the ocean and the atmosphere. It'll impact on weather patterns, and it'll impact life as well. And the other thing is that when you have thinner ice, you can also have this effect, these meltwater pools that can form on the surface. And these are very much darker than the surrounding ice, so you can change that reflectivity, that reflection of the sun's radiation that I was talking about earlier. So why is this happening? Well, I said about warming already. Partly it's atmospheric warming. It's also related to the changes in atmospheric circulation and the change in storms. You can see here a map of the surface air temperature trend in degrees, with the red colours showing the greater warming in degrees per decade. And you can see it's not even, it's not evenly distributed. So it's all to do with how the atmosphere is distributing that heat. And it's not just the atmosphere as well. As an oceanographer, I also think a lot about the oceans, and the oceans are warming as well. And it's not just because the oceans are warming everywhere, but it's also to do with how the Arctic is interacting with the other parts of the global ocean. So, for example, if we look in, this is a sort of blown up map, if you like, of the Svalbard area. And this is where some of the water from the Atlantic can come into the Arctic. So it's sort of exchanged from the south to the north. And this inflow of Atlantic water, which is warm and nutrient rich, is actually increasing through time in the process that we term Atlantification. So this is also helping to warm the Arctic, and also change the balance of nutrients and the chemistry of the ocean as well. So we think there's changes in habitats going on. This change in habitat because of the change in sea ice will impact light levels and nutrients and temperature and saltiness. This will of course impact the algae that are growing, that primary production that's really important for all the other organisms, and not just important for the ecosystem, but important for capturing carbon as well, important for carbon cycling and sequestering carbon within Arctic sediments. And so this will have a knock-on effect all the way down the ecosystem. So from fish and predators all the way through to the animals that live on the seafloor, like these corals that you can see here. But why should we be concerned? Okay, so there's lots of stuff going on in the Arctic, but why in the UK should we care about this? I mean, there's obvious sort of inherent interest in wanting to preserve ecosystems and biodiversity, for example, and obviously we want to have we want to make sure that those communities living north of the Arctic Circle are doing well as well. But the Arctic also impacts the UK, and this is a discussion paper I was involved with last year, led by the Grantham Institute at Imperial, looking at just that, looking at the policy implications for the UK. And it really comes down to these linkages that I've already tried to allude to a bit. So the linkages in weather, how the atmosphere and the ocean in the Arctic interacts with the rest of the global system. And this will impact life in the UK. I mean, one of the things you can think about is potential sea level change, but one of the things we focused on in the report in particular are these weather patterns. So the impact that the Arctic has on mid-latitude weather patterns. So 4 of the 6 main weather systems that we experience in the UK come either directly from the Arctic or from some subpolar regions. And we know we've all sort of experienced what happens when we can actually get blasts from the Arctic, when climatic events in the Arctic are then pushed further south, influencing the UK. And of course, the famous example was in 2018, the Beast from the East, where pretty much the entire country was covered in a layer of snow. And this has major implications for infrastructure, for transport, for our economy. So, this is something that policymakers really need to be interested in. So I'm going to stop there before I talk too much. And I'm going to hand over to the panelists. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kate. There we go. Share screen. And I'll take over for 5 minutes then. And again, my name's Martyn Tranter, and I'm a glacial biogeochemist. And what part of me is interested in the growth of pigmented algae the ice sheet, which are darkening the Greenland ice sheet and enhancing the melting of the ice sheet, and potentially contributing to an acceleration of sea level rise. But the other part of me is interested in the water that goes from the surface down to the bed, picks up a bunch of sediment, and produces some dirty, silty plumes around the ice sheet margin, downstream of which phytoplankton bloom. So what I'm interested in, to steal a phrase that the director of the Cabot Centre, Gemma Wadham, uses, flower power, I'm interested in downstream flower power. So the glaciers often have very, very turbid water coming out of them. And this turbid water flows into the coastal oceans and then is associated with these phytoplankton blooms, these little algae blooms that Kate mentioned. And it's a question of some debate about whether the nutrients that stimulate these blooms come from the turbid, dirty meltwater, or they come from the oceans. And me as a glaciologist, well, I think they must have a glacial origin, of course. Now, the tiny floating marine plants, the phytoplankton, in the laboratory are fertilized by glacial flower. But the usual scientist lament is that there's so little of this work conducted to date, and it's a key need for our discipline to look at incubation studies to see if the phytoplankton grow better when they're mixed in with different types of glacial flower. And one thing about the crushed rock that comes from beneath the Greenland ice sheet is that the material is silt size. So a lot of it is silt size. So that's 2 microns, 2 millionths of a meter, to 50 microns in length. However, on the back of the little flea, of the big fleas, if you will, are these little fleas. They're microparticles, and they're little bits of reactive iron. And the strange thing about the glacial flower then is when you crush up the bedrock, it releases lots of the goodies, and the goodies don't necessarily dissolve into solution. It takes them some time to dissolve into solution and then to act as fertilizer. Some work that Gemma Wadham and John Hawkins now at Florida State have conducted have looked at the relative sizes of glacier nutrient inputs into the Arctic Ocean. And whereas the input of dissolved nitrogen and dissolved phosphorus might not be so high, so the river inputs are these bars on the left, the glacial inputs are the bars in the middle. The total amount of nitrogen, the total amount of phosphorus, the total amount of reactive silica, the total amount of reactive iron, and these are all nutrients. There's more coming off the Greenland ice sheet than are coming off the Arctic rivers. And what about in a warming world then, when the ice sheet is melting faster? Again, there's not much data around, but in the big discharge years, the warm years when there's lots of glacial runoff, then the amount of nutrient that comes from the glaciers that make up the Greenland ice sheet increases. So it's very likely that in years to come, as the ice sheet melts faster, then there'll be more glacial solids put into the water. And what am I interested in particular then? I'm interested in doing the kind of nerdy lab experiments that look at the interaction between the rock flower and the water and the coastal water, either while the sediment is in suspension, and whether it's in the sediment and reacting in the sediment and putting nutrients for more phytoplankton growth back into the water column. So in summary, I'm interested in nutrient uptake and release in fjords, in the buoyant meltwater plumes, and I'm interested in how the phytoplankton make use of those nutrients out in the ocean, open ocean. And with that, I'll stop my screen and I will hand over to Jack.
Brilliant. Thank you, Martyn. Fantastic. I will share my screen now. Hopefully that looks okay. So I'm Dr. Jack Landy, currently based at the University of Tromso in Norway. And I'm going to pick up on a couple of things that Kate talked about in her introduction, focusing on how Arctic warming might be impacting us outside of the Arctic and how this might continue into the future. So we know the Arctic is warming, but one of the really important aspects of this is that the Arctic is actually warming faster than anywhere else on the planet. So this map here shows the annual mean temperature difference between 1960 and 2019. And we can see a lot of yellows and oranges all over the map, which show consistently places are warming by up to 1 degree over this period. But then if we look right at the top of the map, we can see this band of red, where the Arctic is warming. And on the right, this is a plot of the average temperature difference, the warming, for each band of latitude. And so the equator is in the center there, and at the top is the Arctic. We can see the Arctic is warming 2 to 3 times faster than the rest of the planet is. And we know that this is partly due to the sea ice declining and this albedo feedback, the melting feedback that that Kate was talking about with the reflectivity. But another question we have is, does this have anything to do with the polar vortex that we hear about so much in the news as well? So the polar vortex is this massive circulation system of air that sits over the North Pole, and it helps to keep it nice and cold. But some researchers in the past decade have suggested that maybe this decline in the gradient of temperatures between the equator and the Arctic, so it's getting shallower over time, might actually have caused the polar vortex to become unstable, and unstable more often. And if that happened, then the jet stream of air that surrounds the polar vortex might become wavier. And if it's wavier, then more of that cold air from the Arctic might escape to southern latitudes, and equally more warm air from the south might get further north into the Arctic. And that looks a bit like this. And this is a natural phenomenon. We've seen this many times in the past. And it's, as Kate mentioned, it was responsible for the beast from the east that we experienced in the UK in 2018. And also it's the reason for this extreme cold and snowstorms that the southern US and Texas experienced just last month. And we all saw on the news then just how much of an impact this extreme cold and these conditions had on people and on infrastructure who aren't used to dealing with them. So it's obviously really important if climate warming in the Arctic might be causing these events more often, more frequently, but this remains a really contested research topic. So while we have headlines like this from The Guardian that suggests that the snowstorms in Texas were a result of climate warming in the Arctic, we also have other studies. For example, this one at the bottom here was from the University of Exeter, and it suggests minimal influence of lower Arctic sea ice on an increase in the number of cold winter weather events. And in reality, our best current predictions suggest that the number of people exposed to these extreme cold events in winter might actually reduce in a future warmer Europe. So this is from a report from the European Commission just last year, a really important report. And on the right here, we can see that that between 10 and 90% less people are expected to be exposed to these cold events in Europe for a Europe that's a few degrees warmer than it is right now. But on the other side, on the left here, we can see that for summer heat waves, we're expecting 10 to 25 times more people to be exposed to heat waves like the one we had in July 2019. So I think the key research priorities are trying to answer some of these uncertain questions, these questions that still elude us a little bit. And I've identified 3 of the key things that I think we need to look at least from my perspective. And that's to build and continue really strong satellite programs for monitoring future Arctic warming, and also to support marine activities in the Arctic, for example, the increases in shipping that we expect as the ice recedes. We need strong international collaborative field campaigns to try to get at some of these uncertain questions. And we also need to work, of course, with the people who actually live in the Arctic to co-design and collect the data together with them that we all desperately need. So just a couple of really quick examples on that. The largest ever international Arctic field expedition has just been completed. This was Mosaic. This was a German-led expedition, but with a lot of researchers from all over the world, including the UK. And they navigated this ship, the Polar Stern, up into the Arctic. They froze it to a piece of sea ice, and they collected data from the ice, from the ocean, and from the atmosphere during the whole of 2020. And one of the key objectives of Mosaic is to use these data to improve climate models, and from this to make better and more accurate forecasts of things like extreme winter weather events. And then just finally, as an example of co-production of research with Indigenous communities, this is something I've been involved with myself. This is the SICU app. And SICU is the Indigenous Canadian word for sea ice. And this basically acts like a social media platform for Indigenous communities to, for example, get the latest satellite data for their region. So they can look at sea ice conditions and they can mark out places that might be unsafe for travel. And they can also mark, for example, local wildlife. And this can be for conservation, for research, for hunting and fishing. So I picked out just one example of a recent polar bear track here in southern Hudson Bay just the other day. And with that, I'll hand back over to Sofia.
Okay, I think you should all be able to see my screen now. And I would like to use my slot to add some international law and maritime security perspectives to the discussion that we have been having about the Arctic Ocean. And I would like to briefly address the concerns that we, the international lawyers, are currently having about the Arctic Ocean, the concerns that we should really be having about the Arctic Ocean, and what all this means for the UK and the role that the UK could play in the governance of the Arctic Ocean. Now, the Arctic Ocean has formed part of national policies and legislation of the Arctic states for years. Canada, for example, has enacted environmental legislation to protect its waters. Russia and Norway have their own bilateral agreements to deal with fisheries and other sovereignty issues. So everything was calm and there was no concern really there. However, things changed fundamentally in 2007. And this was when a Russian explorer and scientist planted a Russian flag on the seabed of the North Pole. For Russia, that meant that it was a claim that that part of the ocean and these waters belonged to Russia. Now, although this move had nothing but a symbolic character and did not produce any legal effects, what we saw after that point onwards was a rush of national initiatives. The Arctic states rushed to make sovereignty claims to make sure that the world knows what belongs to them. And of course, sovereignty claims were combined with increasing military presence. Of course, increasing military presence comes always with some concerns about the potential conflict or even a war amongst between states, because they all have a race, a competition to claim natural resources and waters in the region. Now, the question for the international lawyers was whether international law actually can deal with this problem. The receding ice created a new landscape, and the question was, does international law deal with the problems that we have there, or is there a legal vacuum that could allow this conflict or war to take place? The answer is yes, we do have the right frameworks to address these concerns. So, for example, we have the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea that applies to the Arctic Ocean. It deals with maritime zones and it tells states what they can claim and what they can or cannot do in the different zones. The convention has its own dispute settlement mechanisms, so states can discuss their claims and resolve their disputes peacefully. We, of course, have the Arctic Council as well, which is an intergovernmental forum and allows states to gather together and discuss any concerns that they have about the Arctic and make decisions, again, peacefully. So what I have found in my research is that we should not really worry about a conflict between states. Our concern when it comes to Arctic governance, and also something that could offer opportunities for research going forward, has to do with the increasing presence of non-state actors in the Arctic Ocean. As the landscape changes, it will not only be states that will be more active and more present in the Arctic Ocean, it will also be non-state actors. And by non-state actors, I mean more companies that will go there to extract natural resources, security contractors, seafarers on commercial vessels, more scientists, more activists, more fishers. Now, the presence and activities of these people, of course, come with a number of associated risks, but at least these people go there for very legitimate purposes. One of our concerns is what will happen with the people, the increasing number of people who will go to the Arctic Ocean for unlawful purposes. And these include smugglers, terrorists, armed robbers, other criminals who will use the Arctic Ocean for trafficking in humans or environmental crimes. And again, the question there is international law equipped to deal with the activities of these non-state actors? The answer is yes, but to an extent. Under international law, we have a number of frameworks that deal with navigation, unlawful activities at sea, port security, and so on and so forth. However, the success of these frameworks depends on effective law enforcement, and effective law enforcement requires more cooperation between states. Again, the problem here is that law enforcement requires more military vessels and equipment, and this is something that challenges sovereignty and makes countries in the region feel uncomfortable. Generally, the Arctic states have taken an approach that any decisions that will be made about the Arctic Ocean will be made by states that have sovereignty claims in the region. And this has excluded other states from decision-making, despite the fact that, as Kate and Jack explained, the climate change and the changes of the Arctic Ocean do affect other states as well, and the UK, of course. So what could the UK do in terms of being more involved in Arctic governance? The UK currently has an observer status in the Arctic Council, so it does participate in various projects and research conducted by the Arctic Council. It participates in meetings, it doesn't have much saying. It could perhaps be more involved now that the UK is a non-EU member state. The EU and the Arctic Council have had some sort of animosity between them for a number of years. One of the reasons is that the European Commission banned the imports of seal products a few years ago, and this was something that Canada did not like because it affected the livelihoods of the Inuit people and the other indigenous people of Canada. So the EU could perhaps be more involved now in the Arctic Council. In addition, in the field of maritime security, we have what we call maritime domain awareness, and this involves activities that allows us to understand the Arctic Ocean better. in order to be able to make better and more informed decisions. These activities could include research and initiatives to tackle threats by non-state actors, but generally to understand the ocean much better. And it could be conducted by scientists, by lawyers, by security analysts. So the UK could participate in more research going forward. And what I think, in my view, we need is a more coherent and proactive approach that will allow us to understand the Arctic Ocean better and be in a position to take decisions that will protect the Arctic Ocean sooner rather than later. Thank you.